Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Hello and welcome. My name is Stephen Hunt from Safran. I'm the Director of Business Development for North and South America. I want to welcome you to today's first Ferryfield Safran Virtual Summit. A quick overview before I turn over the event to the Ferryfield Group. The Ferryfield Group is an embedded strategic partner of Safran who functions as an integrated team member of the team. They have been part of Safran in the Middle East for several years now. Recently, I partnered with them to provide extra bandwidth to assist our customers in the Western Hemisphere. Before getting started today, I want to let you know that we'll be holding our second annual in-person Safran Summit the same week as the AAC conference next year in Las Vegas. I hope to see you at both events. Please keep an eye out for the official announcement. A quick overview of Safran before we get started for those who don't know. Safran has been around since 1997. They're primarily in the Nordic region where they offer a product called Safran Project. And over there it is the premier scheduling engine used for a lot of the mega projects over tools like Oracle Primavera P6 as well as MSP. In around 2020, Safran introduced Safran Risk to the United States and Canada as South America. And in 2021, they introduced Safran Risk Manager. Since then, both tools have been very well received by the industry. Many large contractors and companies around the country and North and South America have adopted our tools. So on the screen now, you can see a list of a few of them who have adopted the tools. So before we get started, I'll give a quick overview. For those who don't know, we have two world-class tools. Our flagship product, Safran Risk, is considered by many to be the best-in-class tool for quantitative cost and schedule risk analysis. Safran Risk Manager provides a centralized risk register for day-to-day management of project risks. If you'd like additional information on either of the tools or have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at any time. We have a lot of great topics and presentations today. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to attend today's summit. Now I'd like to introduce Doug Oldfield, who is one of the Ferryfield Group's co-founders of the group. Over to you, Doug.
Excellent stuff. Thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction, and nice to be here. Let me first of all let me just share out my screen so that everyone can see what I'm looking at as well. That will probably help. And let me just make sure that is now shown on the on the screen. Can you all see my my slide okay, or do I need to do anything else?
Looks good, Doug.
Excellent stuff. Okay, thank you. So just kind of give a really quick introduction to Ferryfield. Steve's already covered a few points, and you're going to be hearing a little bit more from me later on in terms of some tips and tricks about Safran Risk, and also giving an overview about Safran Risk Manager. So this isn't the last time you're going to see my face, I'm afraid to say, on this session. But Ferryfield, I guess, was we started Ferryfield about 5 years ago, and it came from myself and my old boss from Palisade, a company that some of you may have heard of. Used to make the at-risk software before they got bought up by Primavera, and Steve Hunt used to work for them as well. And so about 5 years ago, we set up Ferryfield because what we realised was that there was a real lack of niche consulting professional services firms that were working in the field of quantitative risk analysis. And obviously, from our time at Palisade and so on, we felt we had a lot to offer in this area. And so one of the things that we did when we first set up Ferryfield was to have a look around and look for what tools and solutions there were in the market, and trying to identify where there might be needs and possible collaborations. And we'd heard lots of good things about Safran. In fact, at Palisade, certainly at risk, people would complain that at risk couldn't really do schedule risk analysis, and so we're more interested in PRA as was then. And so we'd heard about Safran quite a bit. So we met up with them, spent a lot of time getting to know them, and so as teams, as Steve says, we're very much a fundamental part of the Safran team. So we do lots of things with them, we collaborate with them, and we've had this very successful partnership over the last almost 5 years, delivering a lot of the professional services on Safran's behalf. So we act as a distributor and a reseller of the software itself in the Middle East, but we also do a lot of their training and consulting engagements. So we put together the Safran Fundamentals certified training course, and we deliver that. So we spend quite a lot of time doing things with Safran. And actually, Ferryfield's also got other people who used to work at Palisade working with us as well. So you also hear from Gustavo Vinweiser later on, who used to be Palisade's old trainer of director of training and consulting. He works for us as one of our full-time consultants now. So I guess we've got a lot of experience in this space. And so over the last 5 years, we've been working with lots and lots of clients in all sorts of different areas, helping them to really get the most out of the Safran software. So we've worked on some very large implementations. We've trained lots and lots and thousands of people on how to use the software. And then we also do consulting engagements as well, helping people run a QSRA on their model and so on. So although we're not Safran employees per se, we are very much a part of the team, and it's a good team to be on, it's fair to say. So just to kind of give a little bit of I guess a bit of a flavour. I mean, Ferryfield's not a massive company by any means, but all of us have worked with a lot of big companies over the years. We've done quantitative risk analysis engagements for some of the world's largest organizations, both on Safran's behalf, Palisade's behalf, and for other clients as well. So we really we like to think we punch above our weight and have worked with a lot of these big companies. And I guess what that gives us is some really kind of interesting insights into quantitative risk analysis and how it can be deployed across all sorts of different industries. And of course, today we're mainly going to be focusing on the project risk side of things, but Monte Carlo quantitative risk analysis, there's a whole lot of different areas that in industries that use it, and we'll be hopefully picking up some of the best practices and processes from those industries as we go through today. And actually, this session itself is actually it's the first one we're doing in the US, but it is the second summit, because we did one earlier this week for people more in the kind of I guess the Eastern Hemisphere, if we're talking about, if we're using the same terminology as Steve, for kind of Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So we did this a couple of days ago, and so hopefully today is going to be an even more polished summit session today. There's a few little gremlins in the machine that happened the other day that we've hopefully ironed out for this session. But of course, with all of these things, they're always live. We're not AI generated robots presenting these things, and so there may be the odd mishap along the way, but hopefully we can roll with those if and when they happen. And I think one final point I just wanted to make before I pass over to my co-director Craig, who used to be my boss at Palisade, and his name's Craig Ferry. And so if you're wondering where the name Ferryfield Group came from, it's a mix of both of our names. So Craig Ferry, Doug Oldfield, and that's where the Ferryfield originated from. But one of the things that I really wanted to make clear after the session the other day is that really today's summit is a real mix of different levels of topic and things that we're going to be looking at. So there's going to be some introductory stuff, particularly on the Safran Risk Manager side of things for people who haven't seen that before. But there's also going to be some more advanced tips and techniques from both myself and Chris Ritson, Safran's very capable lead consultant, and who we've been working with very closely the last few years. So there'll be a real range of something for everybody. But what I would say is that if this is very much your first experience of Safran, if you're just kind of dipping your toe in the water to see what all the fuss is about and why it's such a great tool that everyone's talking about and so on, and you would like to arrange more of an in-depth demonstration or overview of the tool, just let Steve know. We'll be sending an email afterwards, but just let us know. We're always really helpful to talk QRA with anybody who wants to listen, and hopefully some of that passion and enthusiasm will come out over the course of this session. So I think that's probably about it for me. So I'll pass you back to Craig, and he can kind of talk you through some of the housekeeping about how this event's going to be run. So Craig, over to yourself. as I said, there may be the occasional mishap. I'm not sure if Craig is on mute, if his camera's on mute. Craig actually, so just a bit of padding here while we're waiting for him to come online. So the other day, the issue that we had was that Craig's
I was just testing things out.
Excellent. So yeah, Craig's internet went down on the session we did on Tuesday, midway through the session. So it's only just come back on earlier today. So we're lucky or unlucky, depending on your perspective, to see his face on the screen. Anyway, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Doug. As you mentioned, I'm one of the directors here at Ferryfield who still doesn't know how to use Teams properly. But anyway, I'd just like to personally take a moment to thank everyone for joining. We're really excited to have you all with us today or this evening in here in the UK. I get the pleasure of going through a few good to know items, a few housekeeping bits. So all these sessions are going to be recorded, and all the recordings will be individually placed on the two different YouTube channels and websites. At the end of the event, you will be receiving an email with instructions how to access the recordings, as well as the questions and answers. So questions, we want as many questions as you can type. So please don't hesitate. But we won't be able to, or we may not be able to get to all of them because there's quite a few people on the call today. However, all the questions will be answered after the session, and because we will keep the script and send that round. Closed captions. So some of the people in the audience today may be from Latin America and may not have English as their first language and might find it easier to read along. Now, Teams does have the function to use closed captions, and we have posted the instructions of how to do that in the Teams chat, as if by magic. Here it is. The final point is we will have really short rest breaks in between the sessions, if you're wondering, and so there will be the 5-minute breaks in between the sessions. Okay, it's now time for me to introduce our first guest speaker today, J.Wargo from NPR. Joshua is an engineer and a project control specialist from the NPR Associates. And over the course of his career, Joshua has supported many different high dollar value capital assessment projects and a wide variety of client organizations. But today, Joshua is here to talk about those experience and how they've influenced his preferences for executing quantitative risk analysis using the different commercially available software packages that there are today. So I'm going to say welcome, Joshua, and I'm going to hand the controls over to you.
Great, thanks, Greg. I can see myself here. All right, I'm not contributing to any technical difficulty trends. I'm feeling good. Can everybody, Craig, can you see my screen that I'm sharing?
I can indeed, yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Well, good morning, or perhaps good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. As Craig said, my name's J.Wargo. I've been a project manager and project controls engineer with NPR Associates for the past 15 plus years now. Before we jump into things, I just want to take a moment, thank Safran, the Ferryfield group, for inviting me to talk with you all today. As Craig mentioned, for the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be focusing on some of the available risk software tools that there are on the market, a small subset of them, my own specific experiences and use cases for risk analysis, and what I think in general terms about their usability, their functionality, and the support associated with them. You can probably guess what my overall conclusions are based on the sponsors of this virtual summit, but we're going to go through them anyways. So, just to start off, I want to give you all a little bit of information about who we are at NPR so that you have the contextual background that's needed for the sorts of risk analysis use cases that we typically encounter. NPR is a specialty engineering and management consulting firm. We have our headquarters based out of Alexandria, Virginia, with some satellite offices in East Lyme, Connecticut, Burlington, Massachusetts, and we just opened one up in Salt Lake City, Utah. We've been around since 1964. Our roots are actually from Admiral Hyman Rickover's nuclear Navy program. The M, the P, and the R stand for Mandel, Panoff, and Rockwell. They were his three chief engineering officers, and they founded our company, and we've thrived over the last 60 years because of that kind of carryover culture that Admiral Rickover embedded in the roots of the nuclear Navy, that's focused on technical rigor, process discipline, and business integrity. We're about 200 employees total, covering all major engineering disciplines, and our primary focus is within the energy industry, the federal sector, and health and life sciences. A little more detail here. One of the support areas that NPR offers is our project services line of business. We call it technical project integration, or TPI for short. I am NPR's current TPI business lead, and almost all of my projects fall within this service area. It's the line of NPR's business where we try to package traditional project controls expertise with technical and regulatory specialty services. The idea here is that instead of focusing on a specific project control scope area like cost estimation or schedule baselining or risk management, we try to look at a solution holistically and understand how things like the cost estimate and the baseline schedule and performance reporting and technical challenges and key risks all feed into an overall project management solution. The graphic here is just kind of highlighting some of the core TPI service areas that we offer alongside our technical focus areas and how collectively these produce those solutions in the center that we're talking about. I've got a little circle here around quantitative cost schedule risk analysis, which is the focus of today's talk. A little bit about me. I'm a structural engineer by training, but I don't know if I still qualify to fit that description. I spend most of my professional life living in project management realm, cost, schedule, and risk and EV space. I've been with NPR for over 16 years now. A lot of my specific project experience is based out of the federal sector, as Craig mentioned, specifically Department of Energy and Department of Defense projects. But I also have a good amount of experience in the commercial power sector for domestic nuclear generation, as well as fossil fuel industries. Because a lot of my focus is with the Department of Energy, or DOE, I also serve as their current chairman for their contractor users group, which is called FCOG, specifically the risk management task team. So I get to interface a lot with the different DOE risks, DOE sites and the risk managers associated with them. The bottom of the slide is just kind of showing some of some project examples where I've deployed various risk management solutions. The common thread of all of these is that most of these projects are high dollar value. We're talking $100 million plus, ranging up to the tens of billions of dollars. I've been working with different quantitative risk analysis software packages, dating all the way back to Oracle's PRA and even Booz Allen Hamilton's brief foray into ICSRA space with Polaris. The examples we're focusing on today are specifically going to be at risk, Acumen risk, and Safran risk. Those tend to be the three main options that I encounter across the different client sites that I support. Like any good project control solution, a risk management tool needs to be tailored to the organizational culture and the specific project use case. Sometimes I build models in at risk. Sometimes I build models in Acumen. I typically default to using Safran. And what I'm going to do next is kind of walk you through a typical project risk analysis need that my clients typically ask for, and then some of the benefits and the drawbacks and the configuration options that these three specific different software options can provide. So let's just jump right in. Like I said earlier, the three primary options I encounter are Lumivero. I guess it's Lumivero now, used to be Palisades, at risk, Deltek Acumen risk, and of course, Safran risk. For those of you who aren't familiar, Lumivero is basically Lumivero at risk is basically a set of Microsoft Excel-based add-in functions that can enable probabilistic distribution definitions and facilitate Monte Carlo simulation modeling directly within Microsoft Excel. As was said earlier, Craig and the team here was intimately involved with standing up at risk when they were owned by Palisade. So please correct me if I misspeak on anything. Because it's tied directly to Microsoft Excel, my experience with this tool is it's basically as powerful as the user can make it, in terms of modeling flexibility. It supports all of the same probabilistic modeling functionality as other software packages, but there is one notable exception, and that's its lack of direct schedule integration for critical path method enabled schedule risk analysis. And in these instances, it's typically up to the user to make assumptions on both the upstream and the downstream impacts of your schedule risks in order to accurately quantify what your schedule duration contingency needs might be. There's also other add-in tools as part of the Lumivero suite. I think it's called Predict. I don't have any explicit experience with that system, but I can understand from the brochures and available information that it basically pairs at-risk's quantitative analysis functionality with enterprise risk management and risk register database management capabilities. The other option that I usually encounter when we're talking about other Safran options is Deltek Acumen Risk. Acumen Risk is basically the quantitative risk modeling module that exists within Deltek Acumen's Acumen 360 suite. It's designed to perform integrated cost schedule risk analysis and also directly interface with the schedule forensics diagnostic checks that exist in Acumen Fuse, as well as the advanced scenario generation capabilities that are part of their most recent release in Acumen 360. It's a pretty comprehensive software tool that has all of your typical ICSRA bells and whistles. Its Monte Carlo outputs have your probability density function histograms, your cumulative distribution function S-curves, tornado charts, probabilistic cash flow, which is a new feature that they just rolled out, cost schedule scatter plots, the ability to define joint confidence levels. In those instances where you're focusing on just the outputs of a Monte Carlo analysis, Safran and Acumen are basically equivalent. The differentiator I tend to see between Acumen and Safran, if you're making the case for leveraging Acumen, it's because it does directly connect with that Acumen Fuse schedule forensics tool. The metrics that you can evaluate and the ability to navigate through there is actually a pretty powerful tool. There's also some templating templated estimate uncertainty sliders that they like to build into their risk module that makes it somewhat easier to run a qualitative based risk analysis when you might not have fully quantitatively assessed inputs. There's minor things here and there, but from my perspective, if you're looking at the key outputs, Acumen and Safran can essentially do the same things, just in different formats and different interfaces. So while I use both at-risk and Deltek Acumen from time to time, Safran Risk is the one that I tend to default the most to. And the primary reason is because this software was purpose-built for project level quantitative risk analysis. As I said, there aren't a whole lot of differences between Acumen and Safran now that they've introduced a probabilistic cash flow reporting function. Safran produces all of the same Monte Carlo analytics. Maybe let me jump ahead. Like I said, the big difference here is specific to how you use the tools and the amount of I'll call it interface hurdling or frustration that you might encounter. But at the bottom line, I just kind of think that Safran's got a more flexible user interface, with respect to how our cost schedule and risk modules are set up. Within Safran, I can choose to keep a fully resource loaded schedule with costs captured down to the activity level, or I can roll those up to a control account level within the cost module and then tie them off to specific start and finish dates within the activities. I can technically do that in Acumen, but it takes a lot more work in order to configure that model. In Safran, I can develop and maintain my risk register and mapping assignments in standalone modules without having to worry so much about how the model development is sequenced to ultimately make it work. It's really, I just have more overall flexibility to build a simplified model configuration if I want to, than if I'm working in Acumen. It's a nitpick, but I also don't like having to configure my risk register twice, which is something you have to do in Acumen if you're building an integrated cost schedule risk analysis model. Once for the P6 schedule and then again for your cost module overlay. I just think that that's unnecessary and wasted time. I am not a fan of the cost of schedule overlay feature within Acumen, and I'm not sure I ever will be. But like I said, these are the big options. And next, what I want to do is kind of walk through a specific project use case that gives you a more explicit idea of the types of outputs that we get asked to produce by our clients, and how I go about developing those using the different software packages. So the example that I'm going to talk about is a independent cost estimate, specifically for a Department of Energy capital asset or line item project. These are defined as very large projects. They're usually greater than $100 million. They're congressionally funded. They are subject to regulatory requirements that are spelled out in Order 413.3 Bravo. It establishes key decision points and for lack of a better term, hurdles that these projects have to jump through in order to proceed to, alternative selection or baselining or the start of construction. The 413.3 order and government appropriations process actually require an independent cost estimate to be performed by a third-party entity, which means that it needs independence from the integrated project team. And the purpose of this ICE is to validate or cross-check the project's cost and schedule budgets, and that's inclusive of risk-based contingency, to ensure that the overall project baseline prior to beginning construction is properly established. Basically, it's the third-party review to make sure that when a project says we're going to cost X amount of dollars and be done in a certain time period, that Congress has a high confidence of success and can appropriate that funding accordingly. Built into this ICE process is that kind of holistic evaluation I talked about earlier, that the deterministic cost estimate, the schedule baseline and forecast, and the quantitative risk analysis are properly used to justify any back-end contingency budgets that are required or proposed as part of the baseline. The risk management requirements are explicitly defined within a separate guide. It's 413.3 TAC 7 Alpha. This is basically just the roadmap of how DOE expects the risk management process to proceed for these projects. And on the right here is just a graphic that kind of illustrates the critical decision evolution overlaid with the risk management process. The important part is that at CD2 or CD3, that's where an ICE is mandated. And that's the project use case, building that independent cost estimate and a third-party project risk model that's used to validate a project team's estimate. That's the use case that we're talking about today. So what does the projects actually have to build from a risk management perspective? They need a risk management plan. I'm going to zoom past this probably the same way that a lot of you risk managers see your non-risk manager project stakeholders do. The risk management plan is software agnostic. We talk about what software risk management tools we use as part of our risk management processes and procedures, but they don't necessarily inform. The second key deliverable is the risk register, right? That's where we're defining all of our risk events, the qualitative, quantitative assessments. This deliverable is also somewhat software agnostic, depending on the client organization. You might want to consider different software options depending on factors like how the risk register is going to be maintained, or whether it's going to live in the cloud and be collaboratively developed, or whether you want to be able to produce some quick qualitative analysis results without a lot of development effort. Both At Risk and Safran At Risk with the Predict software package and Safran with Safran Risk Manager have these supporting applications that support that sort of enterprise level risk management capabilities and direct ties to the quantitative models. Acumen doesn't, as far as I know, but I have encountered clients who have had some pretty good success pairing Acumen with Active Risk Manager, which is another commercially available software out there. The bottom line is each software can probably hit the mark for you when it comes to risk register database management and front end risk management procedures that you might need to follow. So it's not necessarily a deciding factor when you're trying to figure out what tool is going to best fit. With the exception of Acumen, those same support applications are usually where you see typical qualitative risk reporting functions, things like heat maps and risk breakdown charts and general categorization and counting statistics that you might be interested in summarizing in monthly reports or when you hold your risk management board meetings. Of course, you can always configure your detailed quantitative analysis model to generate those more qualitative analysis functions. So again, unless you're focused on getting like quick results utilizing Acumen's uncertainty factor templating tool, or if you won't have access to secondary support applications like Predict or Safran Risk Manager, you can make it work. You can make qualitative risk assessment work with any of these three options. The quantitative analysis outputs, and more specifically, the configuration flexibility that each of these software packages offers is really where I start to see the differentiators. For this specific use case, where we're talking about risk analysis requirements being governed by a Department of Energy issued risk management guide, one of the requirements there is a critical path method enabled schedule risk analysis has to be a part of your portfolio. So in this instance, at risk isn't usually invoked as an option unless the project is able to produce some kind of back-end justification for how the schedule risk impacts are directly correlated to calculated critical path extension, or how we don't really need to worry about near critical paths becoming critical path. It's a tricky assumption to make. That's why we don't usually see at risk utilized for these sorts of government funded capital asset projects. So for this example, it really kind of boils down to Acumen versus Safran. Excuse me one second. And as I said earlier, the fidelity of the software outputs are basically equivalent. Now that Acumen can produce a probabilistic cash flow. Most everything that Acumen can report out, Safran can do the same and vice versa. The primary outputs that we usually need for an ICE are summarized in tabular form here at the top, right? We need the performance measurement baseline, a quantification of management reserve, what the contract price might be, what the fee might be, any other direct costs, DOE contingency needs, etc. We also need to figure out what does the project funding profile look like? Because that gets issued on an annual basis by Congress. They need to understand how much money the project needs. And that's not just time phasing your cost estimate, it's also time phasing your contingency. And that's really where that probabilistic cash flow functionality really fits in. What I've got at the bottom here is just examples of your typical Monte Carlo outputs. Here's our PDF CDF plot over here. I think for this one, we were reporting out a P80 confidence level. We've got our tornado charts that provide the risk prioritization results. What are those key cost and schedule impacts or key cost and schedule risks that are most impacting our contingency budgets or projected end dates? A probabilistic cash flow input that shows how our deterministic spend might shift under risk realization scenarios. And then finally, a distillation of that probabilistic cash flow output to produce what we think is a justifiable and both risk-informed recommended project funding profile that accounts for carryover funding from year to year. And again, both software packages can do this. These are standardized risk analysis outputs. It's really the nuance of how do you develop those modules and your overall risk configuration that kind of drive you towards one or the other. And so I'll highlight Acumen's advantage first, right? Acumen is a really good schedule forensics tool. We all know that one of the first things we need to do when we build a quantitative risk analysis model is that includes both cost and schedule inputs, is evaluating the fidelity of those inputs, and most specifically the schedule. It's that old adage of garbage in, garbage out. And if the schedule isn't properly configured to be an accurate forecasting tool, then it absolutely won't hit the mark in reporting out risk-informed schedule results. And this is the area where I think Acumen has a clear advantage over Safran because it was specifically built as an overlay module to what is probably the most detailed schedule forensic tool that you can get on the market. Safran does have a built-in schedule check feature that automatically runs when you import a schedule, and it does output a lot of the same forensics analysis results that you can get by running Acumen Fuse. The difference here is that Acumen tends to be a little more customizable and user-friendly in parsing through this information. The Acumen functions are up here at the top. I can click on any one of these bars in Fuse and it'll pop up the impacted activities, and it'll pop them up in a way that I can group and sort by WBS or activity code or control account. So it's just in general a little bit more navigable. So even though I default to Safran for risk modeling purposes, I do still own an Acumen license, and I will often pop up Acumen Fuse to help expedite any schedule evaluations that I might need to perform on the front end before I get into more detailed risk model configuration. I will also note though that I'm a P6 super user, and I have been since I started at NPR. So a lot of my other schedule evaluations, Fuse is great for it. I tend to do a lot of my schedule evaluations directly within P6. So for me personally, this schedule forensics advantage isn't enough for me to switch my default over to Acumen. The differentiator for me between Safran and Acumen is the user interface. I just personally prefer having all of my risk model modules kind of self-contained in separate tabs where I can easily switch back and forth between them with the click of a mouse. I like being able to compartmentalize my risk model to enable parallel development, utilizing a team of folks. I can have somebody working on scheduling conditioning. I can have somebody working on conditioning the risk register definitions and risk mapping assignments separately from each other, while someone else distills my cost estimate into a structure that's built for risk modeling. I can do all of that separately and then import everything back in utilizing Safran as that merge point. What we're seeing here is just a snapshot of the risk register module, but it's basically self-contained, allows for easy navigation between all of my identified risk events, pre-mitigated, post-mitigated cost and schedule impacts, defined probability distributions, mapping assignments. All this information is easy to access and right in front of you. Also, if I have Safran Risk Manager housing my risk register, I can just click a couple buttons on the main projects tab and auto import my latest risk data into this sheet. And then this becomes, self-updatable. I don't have the schedule slide up here as one of the module examples, but that's mainly because I'm usually performing those schedule manipulations directly within P6. And then I use Safran as just an import landing spot. But the simplicity of this interface I found has been a real productivity multiplier for when I'm building a model, especially under a deadline. This here is an example of the risk mapping module, where again, similarly, I can easily navigate around my scheduled WBS hierarchy, select the activities where I want my risks to fall in the Monte Carlo simulation. I really like how I have the ability here to filter on smart activity IDs if I've got those set up, or filter on activity descriptions. If I have similar risk events, like I'm showing up here on the screen, that are impacting similar activities, I can highlight those. Safran brings them up and I can easily select and come across those or enable those commonalities across those risk events. I can do all of this in Excel as well, which is also a functionality of Acumen, and just import those directly into the software, work offline and bring them in through an Excel import. The cost module is probably the biggest plus in my book for why I tend to choose Safran. Oftentimes, very oftentimes, I don't want my project costs modeled down to the activity level. And that's usually where they're captured if you've got a, government accountability office best practices configured schedule, right? Those schedules need to be fully resource loaded. They have costs carried down to the activity level. I don't need that level of granularity most of the times. And honestly, most of the time, I don't want that level of granularity because it's just more potential uncertainty variables that get loaded into your risk model that could bog down the runtime of your analysis. So being able to flexibly define the cost breakdown structure to whatever level I think is appropriate for accurate project time phasing is a real advantage for Safran. And the ability to do this quickly and utilize a spreadsheet hierarchy and change it if you want to, and tie it directly to activity IDs or start and finish dates in the schedule. It's up to me to decide how I want to implement that. My experience with Acumen is that it's not as user-friendly, specifically when we're trying to map costs and model real-time cost of schedule delay and time-dependent cost elements within each iteration of the Monte Carlo. Acumen does have the functionality to do that. It's this little column right here in the middle on the right pane. It's called the cost of schedule overlay feature. And it basically allows you to map a cost element to a specific singular activity within the schedule. What ends up usually happening is you have to modify your schedule. If you want to roll up your cost estimate, you modify your schedule in a way to create these hammock activities that could, if your schedule is very detailed down to the work package level, your rolled up cost might span multiple work packages. So the level of schedule manipulation that's needed to facilitate a accurate and high fidelity cost of schedule delay analysis or a time dependency cost analysis is usually much higher when you're working with Acumen. And I was also one of the early adopters of this tool when Acumen rolled out the functionality, and it had a lot of bugs in it. I had a lot of headaches in the past trying to make this functionality work, and so I might be biased against it. But it was, in my experience, difficult and cumbersome to work through. If you wanted to make changes, it required a lot of back-end updating, either directly within the schedule or a full reconfiguration of your cost module within Acumen. And I just didn't enjoy that process. The other thing that I am not crazy about within Acumen is that all of the similar, like I said, Acumen and Safran do a lot of the same stuff. They have the same modules: a schedule module, a cost module, a risk register, risk mapping assignments, and all of those feed the Monte Carlo analysis. Whereas in Safran, all of your modules are somewhat self-contained. In Acumen, they're all housed within this S3 risk tab. And once you get used to the layout, it's navigable. But I found that especially when I bring newer engineers who don't have a lot of experience working with quantitative risk analysis or risk model configuration, getting them up the learning curve in actually what buttons do you need to push and the sequence of operations and developing a risk model, it's much easier to do when I'm leveraging Safran than when I'm building an Acumen risk model with those newer folks. The other nitpicky thing I dislike about Safran is the view configuration. It just honestly, it takes me more button clicks to get to the information that I want to see in the software interface than it does in Safran. In Safran, if I want to go to the cost module tab, I click once. In Acumen, if I want to pop up the cost module, I have to customize, I have to navigate to the right project module where that exists in this S3 tab. Then I have to customize the left and right panel view to pop up the information that I need. And it's just when you've got a very large model and a high number of inputs that you need to cycle through, that little bit of delay time can really add up towards the back end. Like I said, similar to Safran, you can handle all of this stuff in Excel and import and export. But I've found from my own personal experience that, you do 80% or 90% of your definitions in Excel and then you import them in. But then when you're tuning your model on the back end before you publish your final results, you want to be able to modify things directly within the software. I don't want to have to export my current input template and then modify it there and then re-import it back. I want to click a couple buttons and hit go and see what that does in my scenario analysis. So unfortunately for Acumen, I just find myself getting frustrated more often with their interface than I do working within Safran. Interfaces aside, I will point out there are also a couple of other deltas in the actual modeling capabilities of these two software packages. Like I said earlier, Acumen has this uncertainty template function where you can slide a bar and define cost and schedule ranges like you would for a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 score. These sliders are customizable. They could be relative or absolute. It is a powerful tool where if you're trying to get very quick quantitative results from only qualitative assessed inputs, I've used this functionality before, where people aren't as patient to fully define, probability distribution functions and best case, worst likely, worst case inputs in your risk register. All we've got is 1 to 5 scores. What's our portfolio look like? Let's get a ROM estimate. This is a pretty cool tool to be able to use. Also, Acumen lets you define ranges for your probability events. That's not something you can do in Safran. You have to feed Safran a point estimate. Sometimes that's a nice feature to include if you're noticing things like assessment bias within the probability values in your risk register. On Safran's side, I really like this variable definition functionality that exists within the cost module. It basically allows you to fully customize formulas and functions that you might want included within every iteration of your Monte Carlo analysis. The example that I'm showing up here is a model that we built that accounts for variable definition in escalation ranges that are tied to the midpoint of a construction planning package activity that spans a few years. And basically, we're asking the software to simulate between a 4% and 5% escalation factor for a future year construction. I think this was like out in 2030 plus. And in each one, so it's going to sample in each iteration an escalation value of between 4 and 5%. And then it's also going to calculate in real time those escalation contributions, risk-based escalation contributions to that construction planning package as it shifts with schedule risk realization scenarios. So it's a really powerful tool that me and my team have been able to leverage for different sorts of scenarios. This risk-based escalation adder is just one of them, but it's essentially only limited by the analyst's imagination and the parameters that you can configure to these formulas and functions within the Safran risk model. The second one I'll highlight that I really like, I'm not sure when the Safran guys rolled this out, but it's related to risk mapping and when you have a singular risk event mapped to multiple activities. Previously we could only choose between having either each activity that's mapped to this risk get hit with the full risk impact, or we proportion that impact across the selected activities. Now we can spread that impact to a maximum number of mappings, which is a really cool functionality to do, because I'm working on an analysis right now where I have the project has multiple similar construction activities that are being executed across different work fronts. And there's risks in the risk register that talk about damage that might occur during installation or unforeseen as-built conditions. And those are risks that are associated with all of those potential construction activities. Now I'm able to pick all of the potential landing spots in each one of these work fronts and then allow the software to randomly simulate where and when those risks might occur, which is just a new novel function and way to map your risks within the Monte Carlo. I'll point out Acumen can theoretically do this as well, in the sense that you're able to discretely proportion a risk's impact. Basically, if you have a risk event and it hits multiple activities, you can say, well, activity A gets 5%, activity B gets 10%, activity C gets 25%, et cetera. So you could theoretically produce the same kind of outcome with the appropriate supporting assumptions, but it's not as simple as, just like I said, clicking a couple buttons within the risk register module. So to sum up, I'm rambling a bit here. I like Safran, and it's not just because this is a Safran focused risk summit. It's mostly because it makes my job as a risk manager easier. It gives me more flexibility to do the kinds of risk modeling that I might want to do in a consulting and as a project consultant that interfaces with a lot of different clients. At-risk is a great tool. It's a really powerful statistical modeling engine, but it lacks that schedule integration that is required for a lot of my capital project risk analysis needs. Acumen is fantastic at doing schedule forensics investigations. The Deltek team's done a really good job at building in a risk analysis capability on top of that foundation. But, it's first and foremost, when people say Acumen, they think Fuse. They don't think risk. The 360 module that's connected, it's fun. It's fun to see what it'll spit out when you try to simulate different schedule acceleration scenarios. But at the end of the day, the interface usability hurdles I encounter when I try to build a model with an Acumen risk are just a little bit too high for me to want to use it on a day-to-day basis for all of my modeling needs. Safran is my default because it was built specifically for bottom-up project risk analysis. It's been my go-to for the past 6-7 years, and it will likely continue to be in the future. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I guess I'll turn things back over to Craig, take any questions that the team might have. I think you're on mute there.
Probably good. I was making a comment about Craig actually, so it's probably not a bad thing. I was on mute. Thank you very much, Josh. That was really, really good. And just kind of speaking from a personal perspective, over the last few years we've worked on a lot of competitive tenders between Acumen Risk and Safran, and I can honestly say, hand on heart, that Safran's won every single one of them, which I think is probably quite a good what's the word?
Feather in their cap.
Think of, yeah, feather in their cap. And actually, what I'd say, hopefully, Josh, you and indeed everyone else will be able to stick around till the final session today, because Frederick Dalberg, the Safran Risk Product Manager, is going to be giving a presentation about what's coming in the new version. And it's fair to say that one of the hopefully I'm not giving too much away on Fred's behalf, but one of the kind of the key things that's going to be in the next version is a massive load of enhancements to the schedule health, the schedule assurance side of things. So kind of along the same lines as Fuse, which will be quite an interesting presentation, I think. So just there's a few questions about whether or not the slides and the presentations are going to be shared after the event, and yeah, we'll get them all kind of put together and sent out next week. We've got what have we got? We've got, you said that Safran Risk is great for capital projects. Which tool is best for turnarounds in your experience? Any thoughts on that, Josh?
It depends. Like I said, I think the thesis I was trying to get across in this presentation is that every one of these tools is usable. At risk, it depends on the inputs, the fidelity, the inputs that you're feeding it. If you're talking about quick turnarounds, right? Like I said, there's an example use case within Acumen where all we have are, 1 to 5 scores for cost and schedule impacts within a risk register, and those might have been informed by ranges that are defined within the heat map boundaries. And I want to be able to create a quick quantitative risk analysis. That you can do that very quickly within Acumen by using those sliders. You can also do it really quickly within Safran by defining your risk events. I'd have 5 separate risk events associated to capture those impacts for my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then assigning them where I need to. It's a, to me, that's a question of, is there a clear advantage to any individual software? I don't think so. I think it directly relates to the capabilities of the person that's running the analysis in terms of the speed of being able to turn it around.
I think that's a very fair summary. Excellent stuff. So I think there are kind of 1 or 2 other questions and also some comments about the price of Risk Connect being tripled or something, or tripling since Risk Connect bought it. But I think as we're kind of pretty much bang on the 5-2 time when we're supposed to have a break, I think maybe if we take a quick break, we want to make sure people have got the opportunity to go and have a quick comfort break or whatever without needing to rush back. So did Chris Ritson, did you want to come in and say, was there anything that you wanted to say at this juncture, just before we have a quick break, or not?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Lovely. Yeah, I mean, I can say a few quick points. Maybe I'll put my camera on too. Hang on. There we are. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Ritson from Safran, Senior Risk Uncertainty Consultant. I'll be speaking in the next slot. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Chris.
Great presentation. Thank you. I've done the comparison as well between Acumen, as well as several other products actually that were on the market. So when I did the same exercise, the kind of things that I leaned into that were important to my customers, the people that I was representing, when it came to things like the schedule, most other tools on the market don't have what Safran has when it comes to the ability to actually edit the schedule directly inside Safran, or directly. You can't do that necessarily inside the other products on the market. So quite often you're having to go back to the original P6 or something and do the edits there. So that was one really big criteria that disqualified a lot of the other tools on the market. So I think that is true for Predict. I think it is true. That's the Lumivero who own them now. And it was true also, I think, for Deltek. I mean, Josh, maybe you can speak to that with more confidence than me, given that you actually use the product and I just
No,
trialed
I
it.
believe that's a true statement for Deltek
Right.
Acumen is once you import the schedule, it's essentially locked. And that's largely because that software framework is largely built for the forensics analysis. So you can't really go changing those underlying inputs and still get the same sort of results.
And I think they sell the Deltek, the Acumen Fuse as a separate purchase to Acumen Risk. And to what Doug was saying, we're going to have Fred on later, and he's going to be showing you our equivalent for the diagnostic, the schedule health, and the ability to go into the customization of that later. And that's going to be just a free update to the existing, so you can buy one thing and get all those things. So you get the kind of like the spreadsheet formula editor of at risk, but you're going to get the schedule diagnostic of Fuse. You're going to have the best in class user interface, or force multiplier, productivity multiplier, I think you called it, for running QSRAs and reiterating different scenarios and comparing them. So it's all really good stuff. Yeah, I think those are probably the main things. I could go into a little more detail, multiple mappings. You can cap those. I had a situation on a previous project where you might have 20 or 30 times where this risk could happen. If it happened once, that's unfortunate. If it happens again, oh no. But you bet you can be pretty sure you're going to be learning the lessons each time it happens. So although you might map it to 20 or 30 different work phases, it's actually only reality only going to hit 2 or 3 times. And in Safran, you can define that as you were sort of alluding to. So there's really cool things there. And I think the question on shutdown turnaround projects, I'm not sure if Acumen can go down to the minute, but it's something you can schedule in Safran. So you can change the planning unit to the minute, and the risks can you can get the S-curves, the charts down to the minute, not down to the nearest 15-minute chunk, which I think is what Oracle used to do when we were doing the railways and reopening after a weekend shutdown, maintenance and things like that.
Oh, I see. I apologize. I misunderstood that question. I didn't realize we were
So-
talking specific to granularity of the output for time
No,
duration.
that's my
Got it.
interpretation. Like they can both do it, but I think Safran might have an edge there. Okay, I'll shut up and let everyone have their comfort break. Maybe we come back in a couple of minutes. Go again.
All right. Thanks
Yeah,
all.
so we'll have the break now, and we'll resume at I don't know how to say it, 13:05 EST or 1:05. We always say it differently in the UK to how you say it in the US. So we'll see you all in 5 minutes. Yeah, 5
Thank
past
you
the
once
hour.
again, Josh. That was really good
Yeah,
presentation.
really good.
Really illuminating. Thank you.
All right, thank you all.